go into his, and then we're going to wrap it up. Good. Okay. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about engaging landlords. And this said, we know from the sessions that we've been having with people that you guys have really had a hard time finding housing that falls within any kind of FMR, or for rapid rehousing, any kind of housing that people might be able to sustain on what they are predicted to make. Is talk to real estate boards, chambers of commerce. You know, some people have gone to their local churches because they're people that own a couple of apartments, and ask them, so that people have been more drawn to the sort of mission-driven landlord contacts, and that's actually worked pretty well for people. The other thing you want to do is, if you work with landlords and you're doing housing location, or even if you're not, if you've worked with landlords, keep in mind that in the past, people have been able to search for housing on their own, but in this market, it's been very tough for people. We also hear that people from New York, where I live, are coming out and snapping up all the housing in Connecticut. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, I don't know. People in my neighborhood oftentimes have 3 or 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment. So that would be pretty tough. The other thing you want to do is, when you talk to the landlords, even if the place that you see is not perfect for the tenant, or the tenant doesn't want it, you want to provide contact information. You want something that they can call somebody to rent that apartment if they need to do it fast. You also want to explain the role of case management, and you should be able to explain the role of either, you know, the services that are going to be provided by the subsidy for their makes a big difference. The other mission-driven place people have looked at is FAMI, which is Families of an Alliance for Mentally Ill. So it's people who have mentally ill people in their family, and oftentimes they know of good landlords, and that's a good way to do it too. We have found that landlords who have somebody who has struggled in their family are more likely to give people a chance. So we want to do these sort of boutique. Look, you all have a brochure to describe the housing through your can or something? What kind of housing, what kind of services come with different kinds of housing? That might be something that you push them on a little bit. It's very helpful to give to landlords. It also establishes the roles. I know you guys don't all provide services, but a lot of you have these rapid rehousing programs. And if they can, if you can do it in a uniform way, that's sometimes helpful. We've had a lot of problems with it, with people giving up their resources, but some places are trying to do a master list of vacant apartments. So let me just cut to the chase. That means that people share their housing leads, and that has not always gone over well. But the problem is, I don't know if you're seeing this, if you're seeing that one apartment becomes vacant and 3 or 4 different programs are vying for that apartment and competing against each other. Are you seeing that? If you're seeing that, you might want to talk to your CAN about talking about some sort of centralized list. What we're seeing in other areas with high housing prices and very limited affordable housing, and you're in that contingent, is oftentimes programs are competing against each other for the very few affordable units, and that doesn't work out well. Problems and minimize risks. So giving examples of how you did that. Some places have a contingency fund where if there's any damage to the apartment, the landlords can apply for it. You know, the interesting thing about contingency funds is they take very little money, because few landlords, the landlords say, I'm worried about them destroying my apartment. it's rare that they apply to the contingency fund. So this doesn't happen that often. If it happens once, landlords remember that for the rest of their life, and that might be the ton of money. And that's not government funded. So usually cans put it together, that sort of stuff. The other thing is to do some sort of breakfast or lunch. I mean, with a hot housing market in Connecticut, you might have a hard time getting people there. But the other thing that we do is we acknowledge landlords who have worked with us, you know, sort of the quality of their housing. We look for things. And then, you know, anything like putting an ad in the paper or a thank you, you know, thank apartments, and, you know, they're beautiful, and, you know, tenants are very happy. You don't even have to put your real, you don't want to necessarily put you working with homeless people, but you want to, you know, sort of acknowledge them. People have put them in church bulletins, that sort of stuff. What we're looking for is things that don't cost a lot of money, but will encourage landlords to work with us. And what position we want to be in is that landlords call us when something's available because they like working with us. So the recognizing strong partners works. How many of these things are you doing if you do housing location? How many things on this list? Does anybody do any of those things? Rob, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff, you know, maintaining contact and, you know, is really the thing that's helped me with
Yep.
keeping landlords and keeping a network. You know, got a vacancy, he'll just call me when he does have openings in his place, which is, you know, it saves him money, saves him time, you know, and it's that networking that's important.
That's huge. That is absolutely huge. Is that landlord willing to talk to his friends who are landlords?
Yeah, I mentioned it. He knows exactly what I do and who I'm housing. I don't think his network is as broad, unfortunately. But actually, he's looked at buying other places to nice if he can move forward with that. So, but I think on the list here, there's some things we certainly should be looking at doing. Maybe a brochure, some written materials. You know, even just like an elevator speech when we're talking to landlords, explaining, you know, what we're trying to do. And I think some of the stuff we've done before in the past, where we've had breakfasts, recognizing landlords, but it's a tough market.
It's a very tough market.
Really, you know, once we get a landlord, the thing I think we've got to make sure, because that'll lend itself to more housing. But yeah, much of that stuff's there.
I'm wondering how the end of this eviction moratorium, I know the CDC has extended theirs. I have not heard that Connecticut has extended theirs. Has anybody heard anything? I mean, obviously we want to keep people in housing, but we've also, and there's a lot of money to keep people in housing, which I'm a little worried about, right? Because people, you know, they would use their little bit of money for other things. And I think that, you know, getting out of paying rent is a hard thing. So I'm worried that people are going to get, you know, this money to pay all the back rent, and then they're not going to be in the habit of paying rent again. And it's going to be a big lift to get them to do it again. So I think the eviction moratorium based on this money might happen in waves. The eviction waves of eviction. So there might be more stuff available, but on the other, we're evicted, right? So it's something to think about, just watching that. The other thing is to target landlords who have accepted Section 8 before. They have a Go Section 8 list. I don't know about in Connecticut, but in most places they're not really kept up to date. But it's an interesting list because these are people who have accepted subsidies before. So if you're doing cold calls on landlords, talking to them, they may not actually have vacancies, and the Go Section 8 lists tend to be a little out of date. But if they've accepted Section 8 before, they might be more amenable to your program and they're familiar with subsidies. The other thing is there is a list of housing help resources that's through this link, and it gives you links to like HUD properties that are for senior citizens, that sort of stuff. Gives you all sorts of links. Be a thing to look at. Is everybody familiar with tax credit properties? What they do? They're in bands, and they subsidize the properties through selling tax credits, which they get from the state, and they make a commitment to take people. You want to look for places that take people below 20 to 30% of median income. Those are usually small bands, but a couple of apartments might be there for each property, and it's something to look at. I mean, tax credit developers would, but that you know, a lot of times Connecticut is pushing people to go for the 20 to 30%. And what that is it's not technically a subsidy, but they reduce the rent based on the bands. So people pay it, they don't pay exactly 30%, but it's around 30%. Does that make any sense to people? So if the band is 20 to 30%, they take the median income in that and they charge that amount. So they don't do it by tenant. Falling in the bands, but they calculate the rent based on like a 20 to 30%. I don't think they go much below 20%. So that's some subsidies. Some of these HUD buildings for senior citizens do have vacancies, and that's a good thing to keep in your resource list. There also was a big development of 202s and Shannon, the one for disabilities. 202 is a small building for people who are seniors. Something 8. I forget the name. I don't know why I'm having a senior moment. But those are also good things because they were recently developed. And usually when people are recently developed, new people to housing, we know this, that through the transition, they often drop out. So they might have some. So keeping a list of these places or having somebody check on these places can really help. And they are subsidized. Okay. So that one of the things you want to do is provide some support from the case management team so that people actually put a face to the case management. If you have success stories or other landlords you can use as references, that's often very persuasive with landlords. You want to talk up the benefits of your program. If you can get a landlord to take a lead in promoting it, if they can, you know, if you are able post-COVID to do some of these breakfasts and stuff. So, and this is pretty dicey. We've also gotten one of the program participants to present, and I'm always reluctant to do that, but it's been pretty powerful. You want to also build a relationship. You want to express appreciation however you can. You want to also hold the landlord accountable so that they feel the obligation of safe and decent housing. So that doesn't mean that we don't push them to do needed repairs or if they're asked. We can also provide landlords with resources. If you go to your local HUD website, one of the things that landlords often appreciate, and especially small landlords, which it tends to in tight markets, we're using more and more small landlords, to provide them with the resources of, you know, you might be eligible for weatherization. Let me show you that sort of stuff. Are your cans thinking about rewarding landlords? Some people are giving landlords a bonus of like $200 or $300. They full amount considering what the rents are, but it's actually pretty powerful for people. Something to talk about. The other thing we want to talk about is how can we expand their buying power? And I'm going to talk about shared housing in a minute, but is everybody familiar with what a live-in aid is? This is for any kind of how, but let me give you an example. This came up with a domestic violence situation is that, you know, one of the things is people often want somebody else to live with them or move somebody into their apartment for safety reasons, but it also addresses some of the anxiety. Though domestic violence is a protected class, that would not get you a reasonable accommodation or get you a live-in aid. It has to be a person with disabilities, and this has to address the disabilities. But the interesting thing, they don't have to be licensed, which is a double-edged sword, and their income doesn't count. On the other hand, they don't have rights to the apartment because they're considered an employee. You don't necessarily have to pay them. It can be a family member. If you're going through the PHA, they have to pass the screening for the PHA, which is criminal check, credit check, that sort of thing. And you also get a single person can get a 2-bedroom unit if they move in a live-in aid. Is this something that's interesting to people? They also don't have to be there 24 hours a day. So I'll give you an example. We had a veteran who was suffering from PTSD, and it was particularly difficult for him at night. And he had a hard time tolerating staying at home at night. He just would go out and walk, and it was pretty dangerous for him. So one of the things that they tried. Okay, you may have to mute. I can hear you on the phone call. Okay, there we go. So the person had a full-time job during the day. Their income was not counted. He qualified for a 2-bedroom apartment, and he had somebody there at night. The other thing people have done is do this in conjunction with shared housing, where somebody qualifies for a live-in aid. So you actually have another person in there. And that sometimes what they do is they get somebody who's like actually pool their resources, like Medicare can pay for some of it, some of these things, so that they use those things. Or actually Connecticut's homemaker, that you can get a homemaker if you don't qualify for insurance, and it has to be paid back out of your estate. But if you don't have any money in your estate, it's fine. So Connecticut does have those programs. It's something to talk about. I don't know if 2-bedroom apartment easier to get. Is that true? No? Rob, you got to unmute.
Yeah, no, it's something to explore, because I know, often it's hard to find the 1-bedrooms. And I have a question. How would that work with so like if we have a voucher through Section 8, would they do the 2-bedroom? Would they make an accommodation?
Yes. It has to be essential to the care and well-being of the person.
Okay.
Right? The person has to have a disability, right? But remember, you don't have to tell them. It's tricky. You don't have to tell them what the disability is, but you have to establish a nexus between the disability and what you're asking for. So it's a little tricky. The person is not obligated for the support of the person. So if this is a married person that needs a live-in aid, right? They wouldn't be eligible because parents or the spouse would be obligated for the support. It doesn't mean it can't be a girlfriend or boyfriend, right? But I'm concerned, the concern is their legal relationship. Shannon, can you find that person that's, there we go.
I think there was background noise where Rob was, but there's another question about how do we get this service if a person is already housed. I think Vera, you can clarify if I'm not asking it correctly, but if a person already has a 1-bedroom, how do you get this service for them?
You request the live-in aid, you do a reasonable accommodation. We're going to talk about how to do that, right? And it meets the criteria that the person's not obligated for the support of the person would not be living there if not to provide the support services. which is iffy, right? And determined to be related to the disability. So you request it and people would have to move to a 2-bedroom.
I've been trying to get someone this service. They have a seizure disorder. They don't have a voucher or live in PSH, but they are having seizures at night.
Okay, so this is a specific voucher service. One of the things you want to check out if RAP provides this service, if they'll do a live-in aid, Shelter Plus Care or any of the continuum of care subsidies will provide this, as will housing authorities. So really what this is about is getting them to pay for a 2-bedroom unit because somebody needs a live-in aid. So but if you're applying for a voucher for this person, you can apply for it with the live-in aid. You can do it at application too. Does that answer the question? Yes, no? So the question is,
Andrea.
Yeah.
Andrea, what are the qualifications of the living aid that they will have to provide for them to be qualified to stay with a person like that?
They have to meet the disability. So the person, you have to write a letter that the person is able to provide this service. So in some cases, it's just having somebody there at night because the person is having problems, or the seizure disorder might be part of the problem. It might be part of that. For the seizure disorder, you might also look at a service animal because those have been pretty effective with seizure disorders. So you might want to look at a couple of different things, but the problem is patients. You don't have to have a licensed person. But let me cut to the chase. You don't want the check day girlfriend or boyfriend moving in and saying that they're providing the service, right? One check is that they have to be eligible. So they have to meet some of the criminal criteria. I'm not sure in Shelter Plus Care or in RAP what they're going to do. So I know the PHAs put them through the criminal background check, which is somewhat helpful. Some of this you're going to have to use with persuasion, but they don't have to be. Even if it's a disorder like a seizure disorder, they just have to be there to support the person.
On number 3, under the definition, would they have to have another address?
No.
No. Okay.
No, they can live there. They can live there, but they're not a tenant. So they're not on the lease, right? And they don't qualify for the subsidy. They don't have to have another lease. I mean, if you want to get really stretch it, one thing the PHA said is the person is entitled to 1 room. So the question was, could this person bring their children with them? And the answer is yes, as long as they were in 1 room and as long as it didn't create an overcrowded situation. So it's pretty flexible. So you see these numbers by it. It's called 24 CFR 5, and that's the regulation that live-in aids are under. And if you're requesting a live-in aid from the housing authority, you want to include that CFR. You want to include that regulation. And I'll tell you why. Is particularly housing authorities don't like social workers and case managers telling them how to do their job. And if you include the regulation, they can say, oh yes, we knew about that, but we weren't aware that the person is qualified. So now that you've told us we're qualified, we'll certainly consider this. So the unit size is increased, the income's not counted. That's really important. we're going to talk about different kinds of housing types, right, that are available under HUD. And these are largely for the PHA, but you can make an argument for shelter plus care. So congregate housing is available, but you must provide separate living accommodations and a congregate meal program in order to have congregate housing size occupied. And that the subsidy does not include the meal program, but it's what makes you eligible for the subsidy. People can go into group homes, but they have to be no more than 12 persons. And in some areas, I know Stamford, for instance, limits the size of unrelated people that can live in any house by zoning. So you want to pay attention to that. Group homes have to be state licensed, and rental assistance is a lesser of 0 bedrooms or a pro-rate number of bedrooms. So what that means, right, is this lesser thing. I'm going to talk to you about how people have gotten around that, particularly for continuum of care things and shared housing. But the housing authorities are less likely to consider, let's say, a 0 bedroom for a shared housing that's 3 bedrooms and a 3-bedroom unit, because the lesser share will be part of 3 bedrooms. However, continuum of care programs have been basing it on rent reasonableness, which is a comparison to other apartments in the area, and that's worked out pretty well. Does that make sense to people? So shared housing is 2 or more leaseholders. So having a live-in aid would not be considered share housing, right? And they don't have rights to the apartment. Shared housing is 2 or more leaseholders in a single apartment or unit or house, and the rent is prorated. If these things aren't considered in your PHA plan, I know your continuum of cares are considering them, so shelter plus care, and I believe RAP usually goes by shelter plus care, so that they'll probably consider this. But if you're going through the housing authority, if it's not considered in their plan, right, then one of the things you're going to have to do is a reasonable. So in order to request a reasonable accommodation, does everybody know how to do this? Do you want me to skip over this, or is this something people are interested in? Just give me a nod. We've got to find creative ways to get people housing, and that's what this is about. You want me to do this? I know the worst torture in a training is going over in detail something you already know. So if you already know all this,
I got a couple nods. Yeah,
let me move ahead.
go ahead through
Okay.
it.
All right. So in order to request accommodation, the person has to have a disability that limits right. This is a disabling condition according to HUD. It's not the section. It's not Social Security level of disability. It's not SSI level of disability. They have to have a disability that limits in them 1 or more life activities. And sometimes people will tell you it has to be a doctor. It does not. The clinician has to be licensed to diagnose and treat whatever disability there are. So for instance, a case manager or a social worker with a license should not be diagnosing HIV because it's not within their wheelhouse, right? They may work with people with HIV, but that's not the diagnosis they would do. But oftentimes, alcohol and drugs and mental health is something they do diagnose, so they could sign this. So the PHA or anybody you request a reasonable accommodation of, including landlords, cannot request access to confidential medical records. So be careful what you say, right? That's really important. And they cannot ask what the specific disability is, but you have to develop a nexus between the life-limiting activities, the disability, and what this treats. So it's a little dicey. Requests can be made in writing. The leasee is the person with disabilities. The accommodation is needed to participate in HUD-funded housing program. That's an easy way to do it. So we're giving an example of a HUD-funded program. So the same could be done with RAP. It's all housing programs. And the reason is based on disability and why the accommodation addresses the limitations. Okay. So here's an important thing. The requester must be able to prove who certifies people have a disability. That is not within PHA's or most CAN's wheelhouse, right? The request must be specified, the accommodation requested. So you have to be very clear. And the nexus has to be established. Okay. So the person needs somebody in their home, right? Because this person has a disabling condition that includes, you know, passing out and creates a medical hazard. And this is the reason. If the disability is not obvious, the PHA may request a verification, but they can't request details of this disability. And the verification comes with a licensed professional certifying the disability. There are a couple of reasons why people can reject reasonable accommodation, right? If people reject all reasonable accommodations, my advice to you is appeal it. But if the person you're requesting it from can say priced on the provider, or the provider is required to fundamentally alter the nature of the provider's operations. So for instance, if this person was in supportive housing and they had a seizure disorder that rendered them unconscious and was created a dangerous situation, one of the things that if you requested that the supportive housing have a nurse on staff 24 hours a day, and it could also say that would fundamentally alter what we're providing here. However, if you requested a live-in aid or something like that, that might be approved. If you requested a live-in aid in supportive housing with single units that didn't accommodate 2-bedroom units, they could say, you know, we cannot accommodate that here. So the choice is to go back to the subsidy administrator and get, for instance, our case, we would accommodate the live-in aids by making a public area or a group area available to them. And that's how we did it, and it worked out. But you see what I'm saying? But these are the only reasons they can reject the disability and reject the request. If you have a rejected request, if it's through the PHA, you go to the PHA first. If it's through the CAN, you go to the CAN to appeal it. And you can file a HUD complaint if you are not satisfied with the appeal within 1 year of the date of discrimination, meaning the date of declining it. Does this make sense? Is this helpful to people? Take a look at this. No? Yes? Okay.
I'd say it's helpful. I've never done this before. I'm doing the
possibility. It's a possibility. So Rob, you said that there are very few 1-bedroom apartments, and that's usually what people qualify for.
Right.
So if you have people who qualify for a live-in aid, you might be able to have more access to 2-bedroom apartments. You could also do it under shared housing, right? And we talked about what shared housing is. And there are a couple of different kinds of shared housing. One is HUD's definition of family is wide open. I mean, it literally person, a disabled person, a non-disabled person, a person who's living alone could be a family, a person that's living with friends could be a family. I mean, anybody can be a family. You have to self-define it, right? So you could get what is technically a shared apartment with 3 friends who went under one head of household and had one subsidy. You could also do that by self-defining family under rapid rehousing. So that's one possibility. All their incomes are going to count. But that's where they are, right? The other way of shared housing, which is under discussion in Fairfield County, I know, is the shared housing where you bifurcate the apartment and you have separate leases. In Fairfield County, because they're not using PHA resources, and PHA resources probably could do this, but they're also obligated to take the lowest way you can calculate the rent, which would probably be splitting a 3-bedroom FMR 3 ways based on rent reasonableness, right? Is doing separate and 0-bedroom subsidies for separate bedrooms with shared facilities. So you get a percentage of the 0 bedrooms, right? 0 bedrooms and efficiencies under FMR are usually based on having separate kitchens and baths. A lot of times these have shared kitchens and baths, so that what you would do is you'd get basically 3/4 of the 0 bedroom FMR. Okay, so does that make sense? Everybody know what an FMR is, fair market rent? So that they're doing these separate units, which allows them to rent 3-bedroom houses and have 3 people share them. And they're basing it on the price of efficiencies comparables. So it's called rent reasonableness. And if you can say this is the price in this area, it's so let's think about this, right? Is anybody here interested in the share housing stuff? Okay. So what you want to look at is the program elements, right? So this is the discussion. And I said we would do this in a larger group because I think some people have further along in their thinking about this, and it would be helpful if we all talk together, but that means you guys got to talk. So one of the things that people look at when they're designing this program, but this is input to the committee, is how you select the participants and how you match the participants. So I've done shared housing before, and we tried all sorts of ways to match it. It was most easy if people had a pre-existing relationship. How does this relate to PATH? People were relying on each other before, and they express an interest in living together. That's something that you want to encourage them to consider shared housing, about shared housing. You know, frankly, one of the things that happens is, right, when people live out on the streets, they're dependent on each other because nobody has enough resources to last themselves, right? And so, or safety or other things. And oftentimes people have social networks that they want to stay with. And in fact, a lot of the reasons why people leave housing. So it's a possibility, particularly people in encampments or people that have been together for a long time, they may want a great thing. One of the things that Fairfield County is considering is matching people. And that's how you bring shared housing to scale. That's a tricky possibility. So Rob, do you know if they've developed a sort of a checklist or anything like that to match people?
Yeah, I think there is.
That?
They're working on kind of matching up. There's a document, I've seen one, to kind of pair people up to making the best possible matches for roommates.
And that might be something other people up than it is for people to come in, but there are ups and downs of both of those ways. But I think if you're going to bring it to scale, you're going to have to match people so that it's interesting. So maybe they could share this with other places who are looking at that. I mean, some people have based it on that college roommate thing, but I've seen that not very effective, right?
Definitely.
So that, you know, it has to be catered to the population, and you guys can really, do you with their buddy or a couple of buddies?
Sure. I think as you pointed out, there's, there are people who have informal support networks
Yep.
amongst their friends who are living outside. And, in fact, I have guys that we moved, that have come into the shelter that we've kept together because they wanted to stay together at the shelter. And so certainly there's that advantage of people having that support system.
So Rob,
for
were
one
they more
another.
willing to go into the shelter because they could be with their buddies?
Yeah,
Okay.
they were scared. They were scared of, other people. And so together, the three guys who came in, they all got together and, they were perfect. They wanted to stay together. We're going to move them out we're looking to move them into an apartment. Two of them will stay together. Another one will be down the block, a couple of houses away.
That's
Is
great.
what we're looking to do because we just don't have the bandwidth to put them all in the same bedroom. So, but it happens,
Yeah.
definitely.
So they don't housing is if one person moves out, the landlord doesn't get the rent for that portion of the house or the unit. So they're going to look to you to fill it fairly quickly. So that's a downsize, and you're going to think about that. And frankly, that happens when people come in. We've had people who lived together, for years and years and years, and then they became homeless and they wanted to live together again. And the minute they got housing, they split up. Come on, right? But that stuff happens, right? So you don't always know. You want to also look at the requirements for different subsidies. So the PHA is the one, and Section 8 vouchers are the one that might insist on that lowest level, though there's a pretty compelling argument for rent reasonableness in Connecticut, considering that and considering how much they've got to use. They may even be open to that. Also do a family. You could do those three guys as a family in a 3-bedroom or something like that. You can also ask for, when two people are sharing an apartment and the rule is 2 heartbeats per room. If there is a reasonable accommodation, people can get separate rooms. So for instance, this person related to their disability has a hard time sleeping at night, and they're often up and they disturb the sleep of the other person. So they in fact need their own room. That's a reasonable family if there was a reasonable accommodation involved. Does that make sense? You want to run the numbers too about how much it's going to cost them if they do separate units or how much it's going to cost them if they do one unit, but you can't do the 0-bedroom rate if it's one family, right? You have to have separate leases. So that would mean the other kind of shared housing. The other thing you want to think about is and if you're providing services and housing, if you're providing continuing service, you want to think about things like conflict resolution, because that's a big deal. One of the things when we first started doing shared housing, and it was 20 years ago, case managers spent an inordinate amount of time on who didn't do the dishes and who moved the toothpaste in the bathroom and who left their towels on the floor. It's sort of like in my house, right? Where are the problems? The kitchen and the bathroom. You don't want to be in the middle of that, right? So what are the shared housing? What are the plans for conflict resolution? I think Fairfield County is using a mediator system where people have to mediate these conflicts through a mediation. That worked really well for us. We finally discovered that after dealing with the kitchens and bathrooms for long periods of time. So I really recommend this mediation system, but whatever system you're going to do, you want to think about how you're going to do conflict resolution. You want to think about how you're going to move people if people feel like they're not a good match with the other people. Some structure around that early on, because people learn to work to the structure. How you're going to provide case management, how you're going to do follow-ups with the landlord. You also want to do, you want to think about the use of the shared facilities. What makes more sense? Is it structured that some people get a couple hours in the kitchen, a couple of days, or how do you share the refrigerator? You want to think about those things because you want to negotiate with that with people. And it's not necessarily a system-wide thing. It can be place by place, but somebody's got to do that work with people. What about other things? I mean, basically, we got a list based on our own houses, right? A lot of us lived with other people in the past, and how do we manage that? Does that make sense? So there are all things to think about. So if you're referring people into shared housing, you want to know what systems are already in place, and you want to be able to talk to people when they're making that decision to go into shared housing. This is a system that's in place. Is that going to want? Hey, David, if it's not, you want to talk to them about developing these systems. If you're providing the follow-up, you want to think about how you're coping with this. You don't want a situation where you got to be in there resolving conflicts all the time. And there will be conflicts, right? Think about in your own houses.
Andrea?
Yeah.
So I've worked with individuals who are serious about their recovery and absolutely refuse to be with folks who are actively using. Just say a little word about that, how that can be negotiated. On the other hand, we have houses where people are happily drinking and drugging and seem to make that work as well.
Yeah, they're positives
Other
and negatives, right? They're positives and negatives. So, I mean, you don't want to run the party house, right? You don't want to run the house and that, look, drinking and drugging have side effects, right? Things like noise, rent payment, that sort of thing. So you want to be really careful about that. You don't want to run afoul of the landlord. So that's about setting up those things. So do sober apartments, right? Because what happens when somebody relapses? We had a couple of apartments that people joined together because they all had a commitment to sobriety. We also know that when people first move into housing, oftentimes they relapse. Not always, but oftentimes they relapse or increase their alcohol or drug use. And oftentimes they show psychiatric symptoms. It's problematic. So if they made the commitment that they're going to do a sober house and one person has a relapse, having the discussion about what we're going to do about that. First of all, what I worry about is a domino effect, right? One person relapses, another person relapses. But I also worry about them saying, okay, you've relapsed, you have to leave this housing. But technically, you can't evict somebody, right? Because they relapsed. So that part of it is having a discussion and what can we do about relapse, and explaining to people that they made a commitment to each other to stay sober, but that's not enforceable through the housing laws. So it's possible that somebody relapses and decides to stay. So talking about how that works, I'm really nervous about making a commitment to people that this will be a sober apartment, because there's no way we can absolutely guarantee that. I mean, I've even seen go to detox, so they'll go to a respite until they're sober again, or at least abstinent again. And then it comes down to the day and they say, I'm not going to do that. What are you going to do to me? And there's not much they can do. And the worst part about it is the other people in the apartment who have not relapsed feel betrayed by that, right? So it creates all sorts of conflict. So it's a bigger discussion, but those are exactly the things that you want to consider. And that, yeah, there are people that want to live in sober apartments, and there are people that have lived in sober apartments and shared housing and helped each other maintain their sobriety and been able to do it. They're at high risk of relapse, right? It's not uncommon that people relapse through their journey through sobriety. And what do? That's the question. And know that you don't have a lot of legal stuff behind you to force this person to leave the apartment. So what they thought might be a sober apartment might be sober for two people, but one person is relapsed. Does that make sense, David? That's that's the reality. What else are people worried about?
One of the things that comes up is people not paying their, they're sharing the utility bills and people not paying that portion of, the cable bill, the electric bill, the water bill, the gas bill in some cases.
That's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, going into it, usually having a plan before people move in on how to handle it is best. But I've seen places with the gas bill and everybody took cold showers every day, and that was on them. But it's getting to that point where you can have it worked out. I could think before you have these problems.
It's even, you want to get it worked out, but the other thing you have to consider is how do you guarantee it? So one of the things that we know is that if your utilities are cut off, it's no longer seen as fit for human habitation, right? And people can in fact get a subsidy. Advantage to sort of, somebody compared this to SROs. So it's true, but oftentimes those units are metered separately, right? So if you don't pay your bill, your unit's going to be cut off, but the other units in the building will not be cut off. Well, that's not true with a 3-bedroom apartment. It would be very tough and would create a big barrier to creating these apartments if they were separate. So that technically, I'm not sure about the gas, but that whole apartment would be unfit for, and it would make everybody who lived there ineligible for rent subsidy after like 30 days or something like that. So that creates a big problem. But if you say to people, you promise to pay this bill, and they say, that was then, and this is now, and I have better things to pay, and I don't care if we have lights.
Right.
But that's gonna, if the other people have been paying their portion of the bill, right? Sometimes, and I don't know if this is possible, but sometimes the utilities are covered in the rent, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that helps, if people are getting a subsidy and they have their portion of the rent goes down minus the utility allowance. Another way that people can do that, like paying directly to the utility allowance. We've had some luck having people having subsidies paid directly to the utility company when they've got zero income. So instead of sending people the check, they send a check to the utility company, but we have not had luck them paying it directly to the utility company when it's factored into their rent subsidy. So they just deduct the utility allowance from their rent subsidy. So it's problematic. And how to deal with that, I don't know. But there's no guarantees, because once again, we can make an agreement with people, but if people break the agreement, what's enforceable, right? It would have to be enforceable against everybody if the utilities were cut off.
The good news is when we go to look for housing, we are looking for apartments that do include the utilities.
That's really good. That's really good. So the rent portion is enforceable on an individual basis.
Right. Right. And the housing that we're developing stuff that we're building. So
that's a great thing. That solves a lot of problems.
It does. Yeah.
Other issues people that are coming up for people when you think about shared housing? My biggest fear is, what if people grow to hate each other? And I think that unless you put into place some process where people can move apartments, rent subsidies, so they could move to another apartment and they could look for an individual apartment, right? Causes problems because then you have to fill that slot, right, with somebody else. But you want a process to do that. You don't want, and we see this all the time in supportive housing, people think that if they act up enough, you'll take them out of this situation and put them in a new situation, but you want a process to do that. One of the things that we said, if people wanted to move apartments, before, if they went through mediation. So we put some process in it, which gave us some time, but also gave people a chance to resolve them. And that worked pretty well. We used, by the way, court mediators. And they were volunteers and they volunteered for this project. But I'm not sure how you're going to get the mediators. I think that they're talking to Cleveland Mediation Center, which is a really good thing. But we also found that, but it's easier if the case manager is not the mediator because your relationship is too close and you need a little bit of distance to be the mediation. So that like David could mediate for somebody else's, right? And they could mediate for the people that were under his caseload. So that you want at least a little bit of distance. I don't know how you're going to do it. Do you know? The other thing that we did is we trained times afterwards, because we didn't have time to train them before they came into housing, in mediation skills. So they understood the process. And it's a very ritualized process. And it really helped in people resolving conflicts. They were trained as mediators. Nobody really became a mediator, but they were trained in the process. And that really helped. And that's something you could integrate into your PATH program. And people like that. They get a certificate. It teaches skills. It teaches negotiation skills. It's pretty effective.
No, it's a very good idea to have somebody, you know, who's neutral outside of the case managers trying to mediate the conflicts that come up, because, you know, sometimes with a little discussion and dialogue, you can avoid, you know, something that would tear the apartment apart where people are moving out. So I'm interested in how we can better do that, because we have situations where, and some situations we're not always going to mediate our way out of, but
right.
There are some times where maybe just that neutral person, you know, really putting it in perspective would help our tenants. And you know, it's as best we can keep them housed, you know, without having to go through this whole cycle again. It makes sense. So you know, I don't know if there are any other ways or trainings on mediation, but it would be helpful for us.
Yeah, and I think your CAN is looking into it. Cleveland Mediation Center is very good. But as you said, nobody was doing mediation at that point. This was 20 years ago. And we the ones that were most successful, and we got them to volunteer. So that, you know, there are mediation centers within your community who might be willing to do this. The other thing to keep in mind is our experience with shared housing is little things blow up to big things. So if you leave a wet towel on the floor a couple of times, people are convinced that, you know, you're trying to make them live in a pigsty, that you hate them, that you're not, and it becomes a very blows up, right? Or somebody leaves dishes in the sink one too many times, and one of the other roommates takes the dishes and puts them on their bed. And then there's a war, right? You want to do it early on, and you want to encourage people to use mediation for the small things that bother them. Even if you fix the towels on the floor, it's, you know, the bad feelings are still there. So that you want to catch things as early as possible. An interesting thing is the VA is actually looking at this, and this is through the PHA, is they're doing shared housing with a live-in aid. And one of the reasons was they wanted someplace where people could thrive in the community with medical, right? But didn't require a nursing home, or they weren't going to a nursing home, so they could get some help, so that people were sort of joining together at a common need, but also having that person in there really helped. I mean, you got to be careful about the person. They were looking into ways that they could pay for that person so that they could get a little more distance, and training them in mediation. But I mean, it's not, but it's the whole discussion about, and having somebody there can be really helpful. It's a tough thing. It's not totally fleshed out yet, but it's something they're thinking about as a concept.
David just posted something in the chat, Shared Housing Institute, a link to them for resources for this.
Great, great. The thing is, this is not going to be easy, right? Oops. All right, my screen is paused here. Can you see my screen?
It just says the shared housing discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people have other questions about shared housing. I'm not a big expert. I've tried it before. But it is a good place to go for resources, that sort of thing. So let's take a look. Okay, that was the big one. So the other thing is preparing people for stability, right? So when we're looking for housing, we want a landlord who's going to uniformly and consistently enforce the lease, to teach people the structure, right? Not enforce a lease that's specific for people who have been homeless. Enforce a lease that's consistent with community standards in the community. So that's another thing we want to look at when we're looking for landlords. We also want to be clear about the services role. It's to teach and assist people to meet the obligations of tenancy. It is not to enforce the lease, right? We're going to help people meet the expectations of the lease, but we're not enforcing the lease. So that role thing is really clear. And if you run housing, I think it applies to you. If you don't run housing, that this is where we're moving to, because there's a separation in services. So explaining to people what the role is of the case manager is going to be really important. In order to do this, housing programs have to manage the collaboration, and they have to get management and services staff, they have to get their input. There should be clear procedures, and you should get some of that, whether it's a rapid rehousing program or a supportive housing program, or it's case management that's all. The other thing that people need to understand is that the services that the case management services that they get are keyed to helping them maintain housing. That's a big part of the role. And we want to be clear about that role so that people can use those services. So whether we're providing those services or not, we want to prep people in this outreach phase to be prepared for that. There is a resource here, which is a property management landlords who have small apartments. And so in the back of that manual are letters that they can just plug people's name in. Oftentimes case managers who are working with landlords in housing, particularly small landlords who don't have a big, wide, policy and procedures, they're asked to write these letters. We want to give property managers access to these materials so they can write them themselves, and all they have to do is plug the name in, and they're worded appropriately. And we actually use, so I'm not going to do this one, but I'm going to use the lease to structure the work, and Shannon's going to pull up the eviction prevention chart, and this is a good way to do it.
Lease violation flow chart.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you should know this is a national model. It's not outside, so people can read it.
Does that look okay?
You have also, it's also in the chat, and it's also posted on the website.
Right.
So just
I did in an email also.
just expand it so people can read the word. I don't know, maybe my eyes are worse than most, but I can't read it. There we go. Okay, So this is just a sample chart of how landlords and lease violation, because part of the job is when we're doing outreach and when we're talking to people about housing, is we're focused on housing retention as well as housing access. So we want to make sure that people understand what the process is. So this is a national model. It may vary with your landlords. It's also a good thing to go over the landlords. So here it is, right? So this is about behavior. It's not about rent. So let's say somebody housing sometimes, because I know a lot of you guys run housing.
Somebody doesn't lock the door and leaves the apartment open.
Okay. Okay. So leaves the apartment open. If they don't lock their own door,
They're not
that's not
locking-
really a.
They're not locking the main door and
Oh, they're not locking the main door. So
This-
this is a safety violation, right? Okay. So the person's not locking the main door. So the landlord has a couple of choices. They can talk to them about it, right? But you want to know which one they're going to use. Send them a letter right away. So we want to prepare people that they may be getting these letters. So they let social services know. More likely we call them, right? And they tell us this is going on. We ask them to either talk to the tenant or write them a letter, right? So they talk to the tenant or write them a letter. And then we use that conversation or that letter to say to people, the landlord's really upset about this. And these are the reasons. It creates a safety hazard, but it also puts other tenants in the building at risk. And that one of the things on your lease is everybody has quiet enjoyment of their apartment. And it's important people feel safe in their apartment. And if you leave the door open, people don't feel safe. So what can we do about that, right? What are your options? Can we ask the landlord to, have an automatic lock put on the door? Right? What are the positives, negatives of that, you to do that? And then we talk to the landlord with the person and say, this is our plan. We're going to ask you to put an automatic lock on the door, right? That the door locks automatically. And he says to you, which the landlord will say, well, if people forget their keys, if it's after 5 o'clock, they shouldn't call me. They're going to have to call a locksmith, right? And then you explain that to the person. So there may be another option for them, but what you're working on is how they can change their behavior. The door is locked. It doesn't mean that they have to turn around and turn a thing every day, every time. Sometimes it's important that people put up a sign that people face. Did you lock the door? Right? That might trigger it. I don't know what the person's problem is with locking the door. Maybe they want to let drug dealers in, right? But we're going to say that what's not negotiable here is the door has to be locked. And if not, you're going to get a tenancy violation. So let's figure out how we can do that. If it happens again, landlords are send another letter or send a cure violation, that they have to cure this violations. You want to talk about those violations in your monthly call, depending on how long the cure is. Could be 5 days, it could be 30 days. It depends on your local and your landlord. And they contact the tenant and they talk to them about what else they can do. Do they want to plan? Do they want to meet with the landlord, right? So, sometimes landlords, they're going to send a notice to cure, or they're going to send a 30-day notice. Other landlords say, yeah, I could send them another letter, right? If you're working on a plan. So you want to know this up ahead. You want to present this to the tenant. You want to talk about it, but you also want to say it's non-negotiable. It's a lease violation if you leave the front door open. And the landlord is responsible for the safety of all the tenants in the building. So they can't let this go on. So let's talk about what's going to happen. Will some people wait for the second letter? Yep. But we want it to be cured, right? Okay, if they don't comply with the plan that they put up, or if they don't comply with, or they have a third violation, We're going to talk to them about possible actions. We can assist them in resolving it, corrective action plan. We can provide access to emergency assistance. Maybe you can do it as a reasonable accommodation because the person can't remember to do the door, and you can ask for money to do that. Maybe you're unable to engage the person. You tell the landlord, I'm going to talk to the person. I'll report back to you in 10 days. Say in 10 days, I haven't had a conversation with the person. So they proceed, and you explain that to people. Usually we have about 10 days. If we can't engage in a plan, the landlord's just going to proceed. Process with people. You're also going to get them a lawyer. That's what they need. Sometimes people say it wasn't me leaving the front door open when you know damn well it was. Okay. So that, you're going to insist on that. Maybe you need a lawyer, right? But you're going to view the eviction process. You're also going to ask them the question, why do they think it's you? Why do they think it's you, right? It's all about perception. And then, we're going to discuss alternate housing arrangements. This is what the case manager focuses on. This is what the property manager focuses on. And the discussion is, how you're keeping each other informed. This is helpful in going over to with tenants both before and after they move into housing, so they understand the process. What you're doing is you're teaching them the system to work. Would this be helpful to you guys, something like this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Change it. And you probably want to talk to either legal aid or other people about what the process is, but you want to talk to the landlords to ensure that they're following the process. Does this make sense? It's part of the eviction prevention. You can do this before and afterwards. Look, in the past, you had problems with hoarding. Let's talk about what the process is within housing to address those hoarding issues. These are the reasons that hoarding is a problem for landlords. These are the reasons hoarding is a problem for you. You meet the basic expectation. And this is the basic expectation, that they're 3-foot paths, that there's things. Some people do better with bins, some people do, but those are things that the case manager can offer them, is remediation and a way to address these issues. But we are not there to enforce the issues unless it creates an emergency situation. So if the person's apartment that you see is so stacked up that they have no egress, meaning they can't get out of their apartment, if in terms of some people report it to the landlord, some people report it to the fire department, but that creates a dangerous situation and imminent risk, right? But aside from that, and it's usually not that bad, aside from that, what you're going to do is talk about how you can help them meet the expectation, or case managers can help them meet the expectations, and what the process is for the landlord to enforce the expectations. It gives them a better idea about housing. We can talk to people about, let's go back to the PowerPoint.
You have to share again.
Yeah. We want to talk to people about what it takes to maintain an apartment. Like, what are the obligations of the lease? You guys know these. I'm not going to go through them with you. What are the rights of tenancy? We want to introduce people to that, for people, particularly based on past problems with eviction. And we want to go over that before people go into an apartment, because our job is to help people not only access a unit, but also maintain the unit. So these are things that we can do before people go in. These are some resources for tenancy education. There's a tenant renters rights law thing that's done by Connecticut Law Help. You can pass those out to people. You're probably going to, I know some agencies in Connecticut use this. This is a free download of the RentWise workbook. The advantage of the workbook is you can start going through some of the some of the aspects of it. It prepares people for that housing interview, which is something that they're going to do to get off the street. But the other thing is they can take the workbook with them, and it talks about rights of tenancy. So it's available to you. There's a couple of workbooks out there. I know there's a workbook in Connecticut. Any one you use is good, but you want it to include both things. How they keep an apartment. Does that make sense? And those are available. You have the PowerPoints. You can just click on these. So one of the things we want to do is employ some eviction prevention strategies so that people can keep their housing. The last thing we want is people to return to homelessness. Every time they come back, it's harder to get them in the next time, right? So that, you know, we want to make sure that the housing that we're referring to, the case managers were referring to, some cases PATH programs do this, in some cases they don't. We want an agreement when we take people to see the apartment between the landlord and the tenant about working together. We want to work together to maintain good tenancy. You want to have those resources available, or have the housing people have those resources available. We want to be open to people about what those resources are and what the eligibility is. We want to give them this chart and talk to them about timelines and how long they have to correct violations, particularly violations that got them homeless in the first place. We want to have legal resources. So if people need them, they know about them. We actually often had legal aid come to talk to people before they moved into housing, largely in the shelter, but also in the outreach program. We would have people come in and talk to legal aid, but most importantly, they would give out their cards. So people felt like they had a resource. It also discourages people from just leaving when the landlord says, and legal aid will say to them, don't just leave. This requires a process. So you want to introduce people to that over and over again. And you want to do some crisis planning on evictions if you possibly can before people move in. I am not going to go through this with you. You guys have seen this before, but there's several harm reduction strategies you can put in place. Multiple evictions and not able to handle their money, and they have Social Security or SSDI. You can get them a representative payee. You also want to connect people to free resources and encourage them to make that part of their budgeting plan, because when people figure out how much money they're going to have left, it's going to be a shock. But there are other things that they can do, like use food pantries, use soup kitchens, use free clothing, libraries, to use internet, that sort of stuff. So when people are thinking about how much money they need, you want to try to connect people with income resources, particularly benefits and employment, as early as possible. You want to encourage people to, you know, I mean, David's group with the people that we're all using, you want them to budget for recreation, figure out how much they need, so they have some sort of structure to go along. You also want to talk about what are the norms in housing. If you live in an encampment, people usually keep the same schedules. The housing schedule may be, there may be a lot of you are, you know, having people over at 10 o'clock at night. That, you know, what are the norms and expectations of the buildings they're going into? We want to also consider that when we do it. What are things that they can do to minimize noise? Because we know people who are pacing and stuff like that. We also want to talk about alternate strategies. We want to talk about adding people at least. We want to talk about shared housing. We want to talk about people having something to do during the day, because you guys know their schedules more than anybody, because you work, and that's really important. Schedule is going to really change when they move into housing. So talking about something that they like, something that they look forward to, and something they can do every day makes a big difference, because if people don't have that, they're going to get their own patterns, which often includes returning to the encampment or the shelter. And you also want to see if, you know, the housing program you're referring to will do this no harm, no foul. Some people are going to be close to eviction, and if you could avoid the actual eviction in a full and structured way. So this is an example of a eviction prevention plan. We gave you a blank one, but the most important thing here is this is different than most harm reduction plans. It's based on eviction prevention, but it talks about what the problem is, and then it talks about alternatives to address the problem, but it also talks about non-negotiables. So in this case, the person has marijuana coming out of their apartment, okay, but the landlord has other people's tenancy, and we want to explain that. And for the tenant's purposes, marijuana is the only thing that provides them with the relief, and they have to figure out a way to get relief. So it puts containment on the different things that you can offer people and think about strategies. It's also in a chart so people can think about this, and some strategies may work for other things. So it's helpful to people. Is this something you might be interested in doing with people for eviction prevention, either when they're homeless or for your housing programs? But it's been very helpful. What we want people to do is problem solve. Problem solve is a major protective factor. So we want to help people structure the problem solving, and this is a good way to do it. Is this something that interests you? Yeah. You have a blank one. Okay, I overestimated the number of slides, Shannon.
Andrea, I know you got a lot to cover. I have clients who simply walk away in a security deposit.
That's common.
Are there any sort of long-term implications for them?
Yes.
And
Yes.
particularly if they're threatened to be evicted, we have folks who would just rather walk away and go live outside again.
If you, it depends. Sometimes landlords pursue the eviction anyway. Sometimes people sign something that they're going to leave the apartment. That's really the no harm, no foul. So people could be held responsible for their entire lease, right? So that's sign a no harm, no foul where the landlord and the tenant agree that they're going to sever the relationship. That's good. If people do get evicted, and sometimes people get eviction based on abandonment and not paying rent, then that's going to be harder to find the next apartment. So one of the things is we want to give people the message that there's a process here and that they have rights during this process and they can appeal the process and that we can help them with this, but they've also got resources in the community, like don't want them. I mean, people are still going to abandon their apartments, but you want them to react in a problem-solving way. And we want to talk to them about the long-term implications of walking away from the apartment. Unfortunately, some people's vision of housing first is if they walk away from an apartment, you're going to find them another one. And we want to disabuse people of that notion, right? Is that we want to talk about if you walk away from the apartment without signing something, you can work that says you're leaving the apartment and the landlord agrees, then you're let out of the lease. That's a very different thing than just walking away and not telling anybody, which is what most people do. Most people do that, but we want to disabuse people of that, talk about what are the long-term implications before it's an issue with them. And that's something that you can cover in outreach. And I usually say, even though I know people have done it before, I usually say things like, one of the things that we really worry about is some people working for you, but that we can help you, do this in a way that doesn't affect your ability to get another apartment. I've had people say to me, I walked away from that apartment because it wasn't big enough. So now you need to get me a bigger apartment. Well, how likely is that, right? So we want to talk about people using the process and acquainting people with the process. People often don't know that if the landlord tells you to get out, well, it's his apartment, I got out. And you say, why'd you leave the apartment? Well, okay, so we want to get people back as quickly as possible and we want them to get to some sort of agreement. I'm not saying you never do the mutual ending of the lease, but it's got to be mutual. So we want to talk to people about that beforehand. And I mean, I often use, a lot of people do this. So tell me reasons why you wouldn't do this. Tell me the downside, right? Get them to tell us the story because those affect people long-term. And sometimes people do get evictions on them, get them in another apartment. And if their goal is another apartment, the other thing that we can talk to them about is, you know, if they manage this apartment and get a landlord reference, they're more likely to get a bigger apartment or a nicer apartment or that apartment with a pool that they want, right? So that we talk to them about the benefits of staying for a while, but also correcting the things that are bothering them. And also, but we talk to people about that, and I give people a strong message and outreach: don't walk away, connected.
Andrea, I'm having difficulty and I'm probably going backwards. I have a client who was given a moving on voucher and I am having difficulty finding
Say
a
that?
unit for him.
A unit for
again?
him because he walked away from his apartment? No, I got that.
He didn't walk away, no. I'm just having difficulty finding him a unit. And one is because the landlord providing units. And if there's a listing, by the time I call, they say that they have already filled the unit. And two, everyone wants money for
Yep.
application fee. And so I don't think it's beneficial for the client to give up his limited income for an application fee that from anyone.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So there are many resources for application fees, right? And that the new HUD program, which is the Emergency Housing Assistance, actually has money for housing location and application fees, and also first and last month's rent. So one of the first things that I would do is find out where those resources are and who's eligible for them. Yeah, Shannon.
Look at this. So Lucy earlier today put in the chat the Unite CT, which is a vehicle for those funds you're talking about.
That's it.
Put a link in the chat. So look at that, Vera, to see how you access that assistance.
So that's helpful. So we want to, you're right. Having them spend this money on application fees that probably aren't going to pan out, right, is problematic. Having them even put it out is problematic because, you know, it's taking away their really limited resources. So we want to look for places to do that. I think it's a really hot market in Connecticut. And so one of the things that we're looking at is things like shared housing and different kinds of housing types that will make it more accessible. And I think that that's really important. So that there's a new resident. Okay, yeah. So we're at the end. I'm sorry I went through resources for you. And I think that I think we've got to explore different things. And I think that's why shared housing is so hot right now, is because it's a way to get people in these units. And I think we've got to look at that. The problem is it's a lot of work to maintain those shared housing units. But I think that Fairfield County in particular, by integrating that mediation, is really thinking about, you know, how much work this is going to be for case managers and what your resources are, and identifying other reasons. Because you're right, it's not just locating housing that's very difficult right now, it's also helping people maintain the housing, because God knows you don't want to do this twice. Is this making sense? Okay.
Yes. Very true.
All right, so thanks, you guys. This is our last one.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. I'll post the recording within the next couple of days.
Thanks. Sorry to go over. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Andrea.